Hi, welcome to The Witch in the Woods. So today what I want to talk about is, it's a little bit of a controversial topic, and this is European shamanism. Now, lots of people scream cultural appropriation, but through my research I've actually come to the conclusion that shamanism is not just confined to the eastern regions of Europe or to the Native Americas. Some people will concede that there was actually some form of shamanic religion in the far north of Europe, say in Finland and Norway. And what I'd like to discuss is whether witchcraft is actually a remnant of our whether witchcraft is actually a remnant of an indigenous European shamanism that I would say goes back to a Paleolithic, pre-farming, hunter-gatherer era, and was probably a universal expression of religion and spirituality across the globe. So what I'd like to discuss are the witchcraft trials and the animal familiar, and its relation to the Fylgja and the fetch and shamanism. So animal association is a common theme in European folk magic, and it's often said of witches that they were able to consort with animal familiars and even to have a sexual relationship with some animal or spirit being that was perhaps the form of the devil. They did this to gain magical and demonic powers and to get the familiar to do their bidding. It's a strange unity among witch trials that witches often confessed to the exact same things. That is, of having an animal familiar and of it communicating with them, and of them being able to tell the familiar what to do and to get them to go out and do their bidding. Now this may be quite curious considering that the witch trials happened all over Europe over the space of sort of 200 years and everybody confesses to the same thing. Now we can put that down to the first widely available published book in Europe was in fact the Malleus Maleficarum, and this gave inquisitors guidelines on how to question witches. So it may be as simple as everybody is actually reading off the same page, and we may not be able to put a lot of credence in the answers that they gave. Also, there is the possibility that what we get from the witch trials actually gives us factual information about old folk magic practices and how they were retained by peasants and by the villagers, and whether this relates to a traditional European religion that was predominant before the arrival of Christianity. So there was a common accusation of consorting with animal familiars. These animal familiars were often interchangeable with imps or fairies or other invisible spirit beings. Now it must be borne in mind that the genocide of the witch craze, it lasted a couple of hundred years, and in certain areas, in certain places in Europe, it decimated whole villages. It was an extreme punishment, and people were given no real option under torture other than to accuse their neighbours and to confess to certain things through barbaric torture and extreme pain. So, and we also cannot dismiss that at this time there was a lot of ergo poisoning, which is a poisonous mould on rye that gave people hallucinations or would make them act strange, and that many of those picked out for persecution were in fact old women or poor women or socially dependent women that might be seen as vulnerable members of society that weren't particularly desired, as they were a bit of an imposition on the rest of the society, on the rest of the town. So it was in some ways easier to actually dismiss these people and scapegoat them, basically. Also, we've got to ask ourselves that could actually whole villages of people have developed a private and secret religion that was in fact a vestige of old European religion, and that they did actually sneak away to practice these rites in groups, in the dark, in the woods, in the wilds, and this was considered such a severe threat to the church that they had to take these measures, or they felt they had to take these measures to put an end to it. So what is a familiar? Many witches were said to have a familiar in the form of small animals, and these were things such as cats and mice, rodents, dogs, toads, hares, and generally they are small animals and animals that you would meet domestically around the place, live around your home. They had some connection to humanity, either by living close to humanity or of being hunted, such as hares. Now, often a familiar is thought of being connected to a domestic pet, and there is some confusion about this, whether your familiar is in fact your cat or your dog. Now, to join in this argument, a lot of people will say, of course, it's not your cat or your dog. But there's some confusion about accusations that would imply that a witch's cat was its familiar, and that if you harmed the cat, that the witch was seen next day with some kind of injury or a limp, and that to harm the cat would be to harm the witch. So I would say yes, in many ways, the witch's own pet was considered by many to be its familiar. So this notion of actually cats and dogs being familiars actually brought about a severe persecution of cats, and cats were murdered cruelly and barbarously all over Europe, and were considered to be in some way the devil's creatures. Now, it's quite well known that this persecution of cats in the later Middle Ages was actually responsible for the bubonic plague, as they killed so many cats that they couldn't keep the rat population down. So yes, I would say there was a certain association of a familiar to a particular distinct animal. But this is not the only interpretation of a familiar, and I think this is a later interpretation built on something that originally was only a spirit animal, a spirit being. And the spirit being would by its very nature be able to help with the spirit worlds. Now, I'm not denying that cats and dogs have extrasensory perception, but the animal was not in a physical form. It was in the spirit world, and by this association it could bring back help from the spirit world and make changes in the spirit world for the witch. So there were several ways of gaining a familiar spirit, bearing in mind that the familiar spirit need not only be an animal spirit, but it could also be a fairy being or some other kind of imp or pixie or brownie or fairy, like that. So the first way of gaining a spirit, according to the witch trials, was as a hereditary gift. So this hereditary gift of a spirit was often passed down through the family line. And we have an example of this in the Pendle witch trials of Elizabeth Device, who gained the familiar spirit of Black Dog from her grandmother, Old Demdike. And this occurred when Old Demdike died, that she gifted the spirit on to her granddaughter with instructions of how to work with the spirits, which was apparently to feed it a few drops of blood. Robert Cochrane also claimed that he had gained an hereditary spirit, and this was a spirit called Tomkins. And apparently Tomkins lived by the fireplace and banged a plate above the fire. Now, this familiar spirit that lived by the fireplace sounds a little like a house spirit. And a house spirit is also considered in many ways to be an ancestral spirit. So the house spirit is considered to be, in many cultures, the great original ancestor, grandfather of the family. It's usually considered to be a male spirit, and this spirit occurs all over Europe. It's called a Domovois by the Slavs, it's called a tomte in Sweden, it's called a nissa in Norway, it's called a brownie in Scotland, it's called a hob in Yorkshire, and generally it's known as the house elf. And it's said to be of the ancestral line, and it guards the house, it guards the family, and it guards the children and the pets. And its traditional home was between the hearth and the wall. So somewhere around the chimney breast was a good place to worship this house spirit. And so I'm going to read a quote from Wikipedia about the Domovois, which is the Slavic house spirit. And Wikipedia says, the Domovois is usually represented as an old grey-haired man with flashing eyes. He may manifest in the form of animals, such as cats, dogs or bears, but also as the master of the house or a departed ancestor of the given family, sometimes provided with a tail or with little horns. In some traditions, the Domovois are symbolised by snakes. Household gods were represented by the Slavs as statuettes made of clay or stone, which were placed in niches near the house's door and later on the mantelpieces above the ovens. They were attired in the distinct costume of the tribe to which they belonged. Sacrifices in honour of the Domovois are practised to make him participate in the life of the kin and to appease and reconcile him in the case of anger. These include the offerings of what is left of the evening meal, or in cases of great anger, the sacrifice of a cock at midnight, and the sprinkling of the nooks and corners of the common hall or courtyard with the animal's blood. Otherwise, a slice of bread strewn with salt and wrapped in a white cloth is offered in the hall or in the courtyard, while the members of the kin bow towards the four directions, reciting prayers to the Domovois. So here we can see some ancestral spirit that is sent down the family line, and that appears in the form of animal shapes. So this could be similar to the notion of the Fylgja that could be inherited from an ancestor or incarnate down a family line. But the Fylgja was the soul part of a person. It was in many ways the double of the person that was born at the same time that that person was born out of the well of Udbruna, and was linked to one's fate in this lifetime. And as it emerged from the well of Udbruna, it was connected to the web of Weird. So there is a story in Vatnsdæla saga of how a hero's Fylgja causes him to get sick so that he does not attend a banquet. But at this banquet he would have been killed, and so by making him sick, the Fylgja is actually saving him and returning him to his path of fate, as he was not destined to get killed at the banquet as other people had arranged. So the Fylgja possesses an animal instinct that was connected to the whole and the future and the fate of a person throughout life. And in some ways it kept them in line with their fate, and it took them away from situations that were not part of their fate. So it had this intuition and this knowing and this animal instinct that knew who this person was and where this person was supposed to be. It was the sole part of person that was the guide, and it could also appear to predict that person's death or to predict that person's survival. It could often appear in the form of a spirit wife or a spirit husband that accompanied that soul not only through one lifetime but through many lifetimes. And very often they were seen as women, and they're linked to the Valkyries, the great swan maidens who take dying warriors from the battlefields. So could this be the familiar that is inherited through the family line that we talk about in witchcraft? So to explore this further, we need to talk about three concepts, and these are the fetch, the Fylgja and the familiar. So beginning with European myth, there is the association of a hero or somebody with superhuman strength and unnatural powers, and they are often linked to an animal or a totem animal. And these stories are those such as Rhiannon, who is linked to the horse, or Blodeuwedd, who was turned into an owl, or Cuchulainn, who was known as the Hound of Cuchulainn in the Irish myth. Now, just taking one of these stories, Cuchulainn, it was quite interesting that in many ways his whole life is associated with a figure of a hound. And there are certain taboos on Cuchulainn, that he cannot harm his totem animal and he must never eat its flesh. And when he eats its flesh, that is when he curses his own luck and his own fate, and it becomes part of his downfall. So Cuchulainn is also an interesting character in that he was said to be able to fly into a frenzy on the battlefield, and this is very similar to the stories of the Berserkers and the Ulfhednar in Norse mythology or in Norse history. So the Ulfhednar and the Berserkers went into a frenzied rage on the battlefield, in which they were said to act like their animal totems. So the Ulfhednar acted like wolves and the Berserkers acted like bears. They achieved this through wearing the skin of that animal and through uttering the cries of that animal, and they were so fierce in battle that it was almost as if they were possessed. In fact, these warriors went through initiation training. When they were children, they were taken away from their family at a very young age and taught to be a pack of wild wolves or a pack of bears. And as part of this training, not only did they have to pass certain challenges of strength and combat, but they also had to learn certain chants and certain dances and certain rituals and initiations. And this raised them to be wolves and to be bears, and in many ways away from the human family. So shapeshifting occurs quite commonly in Norse sagas, and there are stories of Freya shapeshifting into falcons and into bears, and of Sigurdur and Sinfjotli, who changed into wolves by putting on wolf skins. There's also the European story of Snow White and Rose Red, was one of my particular favourites when I grew up. And here, a bear that roams the forest is in fact a man who has been bewitched. Now the bear is a very interesting symbol, and it occurs a lot in Europe and in Siberia and Mongolia as an incredibly powerful ancestor. So in Sami, Finland, Siberia and Mongolia, the bear is seen as the great ancestor of the tribes. And it is an animal of great nobility and power. And it is so taboo and so sacred that you would not speak the bear's name, you would call it by euphemisms. So in Mongolia, it was known as Babge. I don't know how you say that, I will write it there. And this is the name that means father. So in Riding Wind Horses, which is a book about Siberian and Mongolian shamanism, the writer Sangarel writes about appealing to the animal spirits for luck in hunting. The reference to hunting rites and rituals may seem to indicate that as such, before the arrival of farming and agriculture, animal hunting rites were possibly some of the earliest forms of religious practice and were almost universally revered based upon shamanic magic and ritual. So Sarangarel writes, because animals, like humans, possess reincarnating souls, called an army soul, which gave the animals breath and warmth, just the same way that an army soul does to a human, there are many rules regarding the killing of game, so that their souls will not be offended. Otherwise they may become angry and refuse to return to the tribal hunting grounds, or they may tell other animal spirits to stay away. When a small animal is killed for its fur, the hunter will put the animal in his hat and wave it around sunwise 3 times, saying hooray, hooray, hooray. This pleases the animal spirits and brings buy and hishig to the hunter through this dalaga gesture. When a large animal is killed or a large fish is caught, the hunter or fisherman may cry over its death to appease the animal spirits. Hunters also apologise to animals when they are killed, saying that they needed to take the meat or hide for their survival. Domestic animals are also killed in a respectful manner. Animals are never struck on the head because animals also have a small bit of tenga in the crowns of their heads. Sheep are killed in an almost bloodless fashion by cutting the belly open and pinching the aorta. Heads are not chopped off because cutting the throat injures the army soul. The head, throat, lungs and heart, which are collectively called the Zuld, are the residents of an animal's army and should be removed from the body as one piece and boiled together before being cut apart and eaten. When an animal is killed for sacrifice, the hide and the Zuld are hung up on poles pointing to heaven. After bears are eaten, the skull or sometimes the whole skeleton is placed upon a pole or platform in the forest. So certain rules were connected to hunting. So animals must never be killed for anything other than their flesh or their fur. And this was not to offend the animal spirits. And any animal that was killed must be shared communally amongst the tribe. And this sharing of the meat would bring the blessing that this animal had been killed with honour, and that it was not just a selfish and, you know, purposeless death. So these rites describe the ancient shamanic practices of the East in Mongolia and Siberia, but it's very possible that these practices were continued by the Finns, and it was part of an original European shamanistic practice, shamanistic religion, that actually was possibly maintained in Finland and up by the Sami a lot longer, as they were the last remaining hunter-gatherers in Europe until very recently, really. So all these tribes revered the bear as a great magician and as a great ancestor spirit. So the Finns were regarded as extremely magical and feared indeed as being extremely magical. And it was said that the Finns could shapeshift, and very often they would shapeshift into whales and seals. And this story is told in Heimskringla saga, where Harald Bluetooth's wizard sets out to psychically explore the coastline of Iceland to try and find somewhere that they could land ships and invade the country. The magical ability of the Finns to shapeshift into sea creatures actually came down to us as the story of the Selkies. And the Finns were supposed to be able to shapeshift into Selkies. And this magical shapeshifting often took the form of a spirit wife. Now, the spirit spouse is a common theme in shamanism, uniting the shaman and giving them supernatural powers and luck, especially in hunting and fishing. So if you want to know more about that, check out a video I've already made, which was called Swan Maiden, Selkies and the Spirit Spouse, and I'll put a link somewhere to that video. So was this shape-shifting form the Fylgja a soul part in Norse mythology, a part that was born out of the well of Udbruna, was connected to the fate and took animal form. It was linked to an animal that was said to have eaten the afterbirth after it was left out in nature somewhere, and the animal that appeared to eat the afterbirth was the form of the Fylgja through life. This animal was tied to the human as a double, and it was often able to predict its death or fate by its appearance. But this animal form never changed throughout life. It was always one particular animal, and a person was often unaware of their own soul form. It could be seen by others with a psychic awareness, or it could often appear in dreams to give that person some kind of warning about the future. So in the north of England and in Ireland, this soul part was called the fetch, and this was similar to a German concept of the doppelganger, which is the spiritual form and the spiritual double that is sometimes seen when the person is not around but you think you've seen them. And it was often said to augur somebody's death or foretell their arrival sometimes. And it was said that if you saw the fetch in the evening, it predicted that person's death. But actually, if you saw it in dawn, it would predict a long life for that person. So the word fetch is also used in many practices for a familiar. And it was a spirit being that could literally go out and fetch information for a witch and for a practitioner. It was also able to go out and do the witch's bidding. So is the fetch, the Fylgja and the familiar all the same thing? Well, perhaps the hereditary familiar was a similar notion or the same thing as the Fylgja or the fetch, bearing in mind that it remained for life and could not change form. But it was only one description of a familiar spirit. Other familiar spirits were often short-term familiar spirits that came in different guises and different forms. Sometimes they appeared for a certain task, a certain duration of time, and they would go. Sometimes they would be exchanged for another animal. Sometimes 3 or 4 animals would work together, or sometimes they were imps or fairies. So there was obviously something other than just a Fylgja acting as a familiar. So one other way of gaining a familiar other than hereditary was for it to be gifted by the devil. So either the devil or an animal appeared, who was the devil in disguise, kind of, would appear to a witch, often spontaneously, and try and strike a bargain or a contract with that witch. Now, this gifting by the devil seemed to be the only way to gain what is known as a divining familiar. So there are 2 types of familiar. One is a divining familiar and one is a domestic familiar. So this divining familiar was able to help with foretelling the future and with predictions, and it could help the witch with things like diagnosing what was wrong with a person, whether that person had been cursed, whether that person had an illness, whether that person was about to die. And so it could predict the future and in many ways give a diagnosis. So the other type of familiar was a domestic familiar, and it seems that these were referred mostly to in England, and particularly in the southeast of England, which is anywhere below sort of Lancashire. And these domestic familiars were gained a third way, which was to house them, and they were often housed in an earthenware pot, and this pot may be lined with sheep's wool. And when you did this, you also offered this familiar a little bit of food and a little bit of drink, and it's said that it was often offered just a few drops of blood. Now, this giving to the familiar of a few drops of the witch's blood actually later developed into the familiar suckling from the witch, for which the witch had an extra nipple or a witch's mark somewhere on their body. And this is where the familiar drank the substance from the witch to maintain its life force. Now, ironically enough, at the end of the witch phase, there was a character called Matthew Hopkirk, who worked in East Anglia, who was known as the Witchfinder General, and he was particularly zealous about unearthing witches. In fact, he was so zealous that after a while it was an embarrassment to the authorities, and they had to curb his actions. And so many of the unfortunate women that Matthew Hopkirk had examined to discover witches' marks were later examined and re-examined by women. I think they were midwives who examined these women and declared these witches' marks to be actually nothing unnatural. And so this was sort of a complete paranoia and hysteria on the behalf of these witchfinders, and really it became an embarrassment in the end. But where the origin of this story originated was the giving of a few drops of blood to a familiar, and this may actually be linked to the practice that we know in the Norse tradition as the Alphabot. And this was a certain ceremony that we don't know very much about, that was preparing a gift or a sacrifice for the elves. Now, the word blot It seems to be connected to a blood giving, a bloodletting, a sacrifice. So it could very well be that the pricking of a finger and offering a few drops of blood was a part of a long tradition that we also know as the Alpha Blots. Now, this gifting of life force in exchange for life force in many ways maintains the balance of a gifting of energy for a gifting of energy. It can also be done with gifting a little bit of food and a little bit of drink to the spirits, because there needs to be some exchange of energy. This is why when I find myself in nature and I take maybe a herb or a branch or a flower, sometimes I will leave a hair from my head on that plant, on that tree, on that bush. And this is my own way of maintaining a balance, of gifting a little bit of my energy for a little bit of that tree or that flower's energy. And to me then that says that what I want to take from you will harm you no more than taking a hair from my head would harm me. And so this is another way of exchanging that, rather than having to prick your finger and bleed, unless you're into that kind. I'm particularly not going to prick my finger, maybe just a little bit, but you know, as long as there is some kind of life force in exchange, I think that's a reasonable gift. So a third way of gaining a familiar spirit was to be gifted a familiar spirit by another witch. So this was said to be a domestic spirit that was in some way promised and then would later appear to the witch, as had already been foretold. This could be, an example of this was the spirit called Grizzle and Greedy Guts, who was said to be promised to Joan Wallace of East Anglia, she said by her master, and who later appeared 3 or 4 days later in the form of 2 dogs. So in shamanism, a spirit is very often passed on to the shaman in his apprenticeship or at the end of his apprenticeship by his teacher. And this was a way that a shaman would pass on the spirit guide, the shamanic presence to his student. So the fourth way and the last way of obtaining a familiar spirit was through magic and ceremony. Now it's a little vague to understand what this magic and ceremony was. There are 2 accounts of people taking the same kind of initiation ceremony, and this seemed to be a rejection of the Holy Communion. And so what happened was that people would go to church, and when the Holy Communion wafer was given to them, they would hold the wafer in their mouth and then later leave church and walk around the church 9 times, at which it was said a toad appeared, and the wafer was offered to the toad instead of being eaten, and in this way a familiar spirit was sent to them. Now, this walking around the church 9 times, as we know, churches were on very sacred and traditional power spots, power places. And it also appears in some other rituals. The one that comes to mind to me is Arsgang, which is where you would go out at midnight on New Year's Eve or Christmas Eve to meet the spirits and to gain some prediction to the future. And this would often involve walking around a church, now in this case anti-clockwise, 3 or 9 times, and then meeting whatever spirits you found on that night and gaining some kind of insight or foretelling the future of the coming year in some way. And it would seem to be that this is a very ancient practice, and so there may have been some kind of link to an ancient practice of walking circularly 9 times around a holy place. So finally, in France, the stories of shape-shifting were recorded to actually have connections to the wearing of an animal mask and the wearing of animal skins, and to dancing. Now, dancing and putting on animal furs, animal skins and animal masks were part of the warrior cults of the Ulfhednar and the Berserkers. And strangely, in their battle frenzy, they were also said to not only wear masks and skins of animals, but to make cries and screams of animals. And it's through this identification of making animal sounds and wearing animal skins and animal masks that they were possessed by the spirit of that animal. Now, the making of animal sounds was part of the possession of a shaman too. And of this, Mircea Eliade writes in the book Shamanism and Archaic Techniques of Ecstasy that the shaman becomes possessed by making the cries and sounds of animals, and that this is a secret language by which he can talk to spirits. The sound may be the roaring of a dog, the cry of a wolf, or cries or bleats or grunts, or the cries of songs of birds. And while he does this, the spirit descends on him. In fact, learning the cries and the songs of the birds is especially linked to this secret language with which to talk to spirit. The Germanic term for magical formula is galda, derived from the verb galan, to sing, a term that is applied especially to bird calls. By this making of animal sounds and animals, particularly bird sounds, bird songs, the shaman is there able to talk the language of old nature and commune with spirit. Now, interestingly, Mircea Eliade also writes that before this ritual, a shaman would often eat a snake, and the snake was seen as the repository of all the souls of the animals. And so the eating of this serpent or this snake granted the shaman the power to converse the animal language. Now, if you've seen my video on Druidry, you will understand that the process of eating the serpent or the snake and speaking the language of the birds is something that is also mentioned in European tradition and in Druidic tradition. Very shamanic. So, I would say that there are quite a lot of coincidental comparisons to witchcraft, European tradition, and Eastern shamanism. So, just a few words to end, because I know I've been going on quite some time now. So in several accounts, these cunning people were experiencing a great deal of personal, practical difficulty in their life relating to survival and coping with the mortal world, basically. And it is then that they say in the witchcraft trials that these spirits appeared to them. Now, Emma Wilby identifies these recurring motifs as a remnant of a shamanic and familiar appearance in fairy tales that come down to us in fairy tales, such as Rumpelstiltskin, the Frog Prince, and Puss in Boots. Of course, our European folk tales still contain many threads of traditional folk magic and folk tradition. She says the protagonist is approached by a supernatural being when they are in need of aid, something that she connected to the appearance of familiar spirits in the early modern accounts of them. She believed, this is taken from Wikipedia, there is a direct connection between the belief in and accounts of familiar spirits with these folk tales, because these fairy stories and myths originate from the same reservoir of folk belief as the description of familiar encounters given by cunning folk and witches. So, of these animal spirit helpers and spirit helpers, Mircea Eliade writes in Archaic Techniques of Ecstasy, the tutelary animal of the Buryat shamans is called kubilgan, a term that can be interpreted as metamorphosis, from kilbiku, to change oneself, to take on another form. In other words, the tutelary animal not only enables the shaman to transform himself, it is, in a manner, his own double, his alter ego. This alter ego is one of the shaman's souls, the soul in animal form, or more precisely, the life soul. So, was witchcraft a form of indigenous European shamanism that was somehow lost through the advent of Christianity and suppressed through Christianity, till we can almost not even believe in our own roots and heritage anymore? Well, some similarities may lead us to conclude that this was an ancient form of spirit communication between a practitioner and an animal spirit guide, or a otherworldly spirit guide, such as some kind of fairy being. The similarities that are there between witchcraft and shamanism are the feeding of animal spirits or supernatural spirits and giving them a home in which to inhabit, where offerings of food and drink were left for them. Shape-shifting and spirit flight in the form of an animal, inheriting a spirit from a family line or a soul part, inherited through ancestry that took on an animal form, and the changing of spirit helpers who appear as animals to help with specific tasks, purposes, and through which, in that form, the witch or the shaman can travel through the other worlds. So there's a little bit of contentious debate about the term shamanism and its use and cultural appropriation, which is very hard to say, and whether we should in fact use shamanic practices without giving credit to the cultures from which they actually originated. I would like to add to that we are the cultures through which they actually originated. I do believe that shamanism is the earliest form of religion. It probably stems from Paleolithic hunter-gatherers. It is probably part of hunting rites and rituals, and it takes us back to our own animal form, to our own animal language. If you've got any comments on that, then please feel free to argue that and debate it in the box below. But I think there is some foundation to believe in our own shamanic tradition and to have the audacity to call it a shamanic tradition. So thank you for listening. I know I've talked a long time about this. Tell me about your spirit familiars as well. Do you think it's your cat? Have you met a familiar in a dream? Have you any experience of inviting one into your house? So thank you again. I hope you found that of some interest or some use, and I hope to speak to you all again soon. Cheers, bye.